My name is Wade Hollister. For 14 years, I worked a job that doesn't have a clean title, so when people asked, I usually said pest control. That was close enough to be true, and far enough from the truth that nobody asked a follow-up question. Pest control is what you call it when somebody has raccoons in the attic. What I did was the job underneath that one. The job you get called for when the raccoons aren't raccoons, and the man on the phone has stopped sleeping, and his wife is staying at her sister's house, and the sheriff already came out twice and wrote it up as coyotes both times, and everybody involved knows it isn't coyotes. I'm telling this now because I quit last spring, and I haven't worked a day since, and I don't plan to. I'm 48 years old. I have a daughter in college in Ohio. I have a small house outside Erie, Pennsylvania that I paid off 2 years ago with the money from this work. I'm not poor, and I'm not in any kind of trouble. I quit because of one job in Kentucky, and I want to put it down somewhere outside of my own head because I've found that if you carry a thing like that alone for too long, it starts to talk to you. I'll get to Kentucky, but the job won't make sense unless you understand what the work was before that. So I'm going to walk through it the way I'd walk through it with a new client. Slow, in order, no skipping ahead. I learned the trade from my mother's brother, a man named Cal Hollister, who ran a nuisance wildlife business out of a barn in Tioga County. Cal trapped beavers and raccoons and the occasional bear for 40 years. He also did the other work, the work nobody listed on a business card. And toward the end of his life, he started taking me on those jobs because his hands had gotten bad, and he needed somebody to handle the cages. I was 19 the first time. The job was a basement in Williamsport. The client was a widow whose late husband had built the basement himself in 1962. And something had moved into the crawl space behind the furnace, and it had been there for what she thought was about 6 months. The dog wouldn't go downstairs. The cat had stopped eating. She herself had started losing weight she couldn't explain, and her doctor had run every test and found nothing. Cal sat in her kitchen for 2 hours before we even went into the basement. He drank her coffee and asked her about her husband and her grown children, and the history of the house. He took notes in a small green notebook with a pencil. He asked her what she dreamed about. She cried at that question and told him, and he wrote it down, and then he stood up and said, we'd handle it. And we went into the basement and we handled it. I won't tell you what was back there. It doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what Cal told me on the drive home, because it became the foundation of how I worked for the next 14 years. He said, most of what people call monsters are just animals you haven't met yet. Animals have territory. Animals have hunger. Animals have a window of activity and a window of rest. And if you sit still long enough and watch, you can map them. And once you can map them, you can remove them. He said the work isn't brave and it isn't holy. It's patient. He said the men who got killed doing this work got killed because they thought they were heroes. He said heroes die. Trappers go home. I worked alongside him for 4 more years before he passed. And after he passed, I took over his client list and started building my own. By the time I was 30, I was running about 30 jobs a year, mostly within a 6-state radius, mostly in rural areas, mostly for people who'd already exhausted the normal options and didn't know what was left. I had a website that just said Hollister Wildlife Solutions and a phone number. The clients who needed the other kind of work always found me through somebody. There's a quiet network for that. Sheriffs who'd seen something they couldn't write up, county extension agents, old funeral home directors, a couple of priests. They knew my name, and they passed it along when it was needed. The work, day to day, was not what people imagine. It was mostly driving, long drives down state routes with a pickup full of equipment, sleeping in motels off the highway, eating gas station food, sitting in living rooms drinking coffee with people whose lives had been quietly coming apart for months. The actual encounters were a small percentage of the time. Most of the job was listening, mapping, and waiting. I kept records. I'm a record-keeping kind of person. I had a binder for every job, with intake notes, photos of the property, weather data, a hand-drawn map of where I set my equipment, and a closeout summary. I have those binders in a storage unit now. I haven't opened them since I quit. I won't open them again, but I remember enough. I'll give you the texture of it. There was a job in West Virginia in my 4th year, in a holler outside of Beckley, where a family had been losing chickens at a rate that didn't match any predator. Foxes take one. Raccoons make a mess. This was different. The chickens were leaving the coop, walking out, and not coming back. The coop door was being opened from the outside, but there were no tracks, no fingerprints, nothing on the trail cams except, every few nights, a frame or two of motion blur that the camera couldn't focus on. I sat in that yard for 9 nights. On the 10th night, I figured out where it was nesting, and I closed the nest. The family kept their chickens after that. The husband shook my hand and gave me a check, and I drove home and slept for 2 days. That's a normal job. There was a job in upstate New York where a man had bought an old dairy farm at auction, and the previous owner's wife had killed herself in the milking parlor in 1987. And something had grown in the parlor in the years the farm sat empty. That one took me 3 weeks. I won't describe it. The man sold the farm afterward and moved to Florida. There was a job in Maine where a lighthouse keeper's daughter, an older woman who'd inherited the keeper's house, was hearing her father's voice on the radio every night between 2 and 4 in the morning, and her father had been dead for 20 years, and the radio wasn't plugged in. That one I solved by removing the radio, burning it, and salting the ground where the antenna had been buried. She slept after that. She sent me a Christmas card every year for 9 years. She died in 2022, and her son sent me a note letting me know. I'm telling you all this so you understand. I was good at this. I'd done it long enough that I had a system, and the system worked. And I lost very few clients, and I never lost myself. I'd been hurt twice, neither time badly. I'd been frightened more times than I could count, but fear is a tool in this work, the same way pain is a tool for somebody who works with their hands. You learn to read it and you learn to use it. I had 3 rules I worked by. They weren't anything mystical, they were just what Cal taught me and what I'd added to over the years. The first one was never take a job you don't understand the shape of after the intake. If I sat in a client's kitchen for 2 hours and I still didn't know what we were dealing with, I didn't take the job. I'd refer them to somebody else, or I'd tell them I couldn't help, and I'd give them their money back if they had already paid a deposit. Cal used to say that the worst jobs are the ones that hide their shape on purpose, and the only way to lose to one of those is to enter it before you can see it. The second rule was never work on land where the family has lived longer than 4 generations. I picked that one up myself around year 6. I'd done 2 jobs back to back on old family land in Virginia and Tennessee, and both of them had gone wrong in the same way, which was that the thing I was dealing with wasn't separate from the family. It was tangled into them. You couldn't remove it without removing pieces of them, and they didn't want those pieces removed, even when the pieces were killing them. After the second one, I added the rule. 4 generations was my cutoff. If the family had been on the land that long, whatever was there had made a deal with them, even if they didn't remember the deal, and you can't break a deal you don't have the terms of. The third rule was the one I broke. I'll get to it. Kentucky came in March of last year. I got a call on a Tuesday afternoon from a man named Brennan Tate. He'd gotten my number from a sheriff in Perry County who'd worked with me on a job in 2019. Brennan owned about 600 acres in Letcher County, in a hollow between 2 ridges, and his family had been on that land since 1881. He told me that on the phone in the first 3 minutes, and the second rule should have ended the call right there. I didn't end the call. I want to be honest about why. It was March, and I'd had a slow winter, and I'd been thinking about my daughter's tuition for the fall semester, And Brennan said on the phone that he was prepared to pay double my rate. He didn't haggle. He didn't ask what I'd do for the money. He said it like a man who had already decided and was waiting for me to catch up to the decision. And the way he described the situation in the rest of the call sounded like the shape of it was clean. Livestock predation, mostly cattle, some calves, some adult cows, tracks that didn't match anything the local game warden could identify. Dogs in the area going quiet at night, then refusing to come outside in the morning. Standard signs. The shape was visible. It looked like something I'd handled a dozen times before. I broke the second rule. I told Brennan I'd come down for an intake, and we'd see. I drove from Erie to Letcher County over 2 days. I stayed in a motel in Whitesburg the first night, and drove out to his property in the morning. The land was beautiful in the way that part of Kentucky is beautiful. Low mountains close on either side. A creek running through the bottom of the hollow. A single road in and out. Fog still pooled in the low places at 10 in the morning. The Tate house was a 2-story frame house with a front porch and a tin roof, and it had been added onto in pieces over a century, so the back of it didn't match the front, and the kitchen was 3 steps down from the parlor. Brennan met me on the porch. He was about 60, lean, clean-shaven, wearing a flannel shirt and work pants. He shook my hand and brought me inside. His wife, Coletta, made coffee. She was a small woman, maybe 15 years younger than him, and she didn't say much. She set the coffee down and went back into the kitchen and stayed there. There was a teenage boy somewhere upstairs whose footsteps I heard once and didn't hear again. There was a framed photograph in the front hall of an old man in a suit sitting in a chair on the same porch I'd just walked across, and the photograph looked like it had been taken in the 1920s, and the chair in the photograph was the same chair Brennan was sitting in now. I did the intake the way Cal taught me. I sat in the parlor and I drank the coffee, and I asked Brennan to walk me through it from the beginning. He started at the beginning. The losses had begun in October. 2 cows in 1 week, both adult, both found in the lower pasture down near the creek. Both opened up in a way that didn't match a coyote pack or a single bear. He'd called the game warden. The warden had come out and looked and said he didn't know. After that, there'd been 1 or 2 losses a month all winter, with a gap in February when the snow was deep, and then it had picked back up in early March. And now he was losing an animal a week. I asked him about the dogs. He had 3 working dogs, 2 for the cattle, and 1 that lived in the house. The 2 outside dogs had stopped barking at night around Christmas. They still ate, they still worked during the day, but at night they went into the barn and lay down and didn't move and didn't make a sound. The house dog had started sleeping in the boys' bedroom, on the floor next to the bed, which it had never done before. I asked him about tracks. He took me out to the lower pasture and showed me a place by the creek where the ground was soft, and there was a single print there that was about the size of my hand splayed open. It wasn't a paw print. It wasn't a hoof print. It had 4 points of pressure and a long mark behind it, like something had set down with weight and then dragged. I photographed it. I measured it. I made a note in my book. I asked him about the family. This is where the intake started to feel wrong, and I want to walk through it carefully because at the time I told myself it was nothing. I asked him how long the family had been on the land. He said since 1881, his great-great-grandfather had bought the original parcel from a coal company. I asked him if there had been losses like this before in the family history. He said there had. He said his grandfather had told him about a stretch in the 1930s when they'd lost most of a herd, and his great-grandfather had told his grandfather about a stretch in the 1890s when they'd lost a child. I asked him what he meant by lost. He said the child had wandered off and not come back. I asked him how old. He said 4. I asked him what the family had done about it in the 1890s and the 1930s, and he was quiet for a moment, and he said, "We waited." He said it like that, plural, in the voice of a man speaking for people who weren't in the room. That should have been the end of it. I had the shape now, and the shape wasn't clean. The shape was a thing that had been on this land as long as the family had been on this land, and the family knew it, and the family had been managing it for 140-some years, and Brennan wasn't hiring me to remove it. He was hiring me for something else. I didn't know what yet. I should have driven back to Whitesburg, packed my bag, refunded the deposit, and gone home. I broke the second rule, and once you break the second rule, the third rule becomes very hard to keep. The third rule is that you do not take a job where you can't see why the client wants you specifically. If a client's reason for hiring you is unclear, the reason is usually not in your favor. I told Brennan I needed to spend a few days on the property before I committed. He said that was fine. He offered me the use of a small cabin he had at the back of the property, up against the ridge, that he'd built for hunting and that nobody used in the spring. I accepted. I told him I'd start that night. I drove back to Whitesburg, picked up my equipment from the motel, checked out, and drove back to the property. Brennan walked me up to the cabin. It was a one-room structure with a wood stove, a bunk, a small table, and a window that faced down the hollow toward the house. The walls were chinked logs. It had been built recently, maybe 10 years ago, but it was built in an old style. There was a kerosene lantern on the table and a box of matches. There was no electricity and no plumbing. He showed me the outhouse and the spring where I could get water, and he left me there before dark. I set up. I have a kit I bring on every job. Trail cameras, motion sensors, a thermal scope, a digital recorder, a notebook, a sidearm, a long gun, 2 knives, a roll of copper wire, a roll of iron wire, a small bag of coarse salt, a bottle of vinegar, and a few other things that are mine specifically and that I don't talk about. I set the trail cameras at the edge of the lower pasture and along the creek where the print had been. I set motion sensors on the approach to the cabin. I set a recorder on the porch of the cabin pointed downhill. I checked everything twice. Then I sat in the cabin with the lantern lit, and I waited. The first night was nothing. I want to say that clearly, because the first night was a lie, and I didn't know it was a lie until later. Nothing happened. The motion sensors didn't trip. The trail cameras caught a fox and an opossum and 1 deer, and that was all. The recorder picked up wind, a single owl, and the creek. I slept 4 hours starting around 3 in the morning. I woke at sunrise. The dogs in the barn down by the house had not barked in the night. I noted that. I spent the second day walking the property. 600 acres is a lot of ground to cover, and I didn't cover all of it, but I walked the perimeter of the lower pasture, the creek bottom, the timber on the south ridge, and the old graveyard. There was an old graveyard on the south ridge. Brennan hadn't mentioned it. I found it in the early afternoon, walking along an old logging road that had grown up in laurel. It was about a 1/4 acre, fenced with iron, the gate hanging on one hinge. The stones were Tate stones, going back to the 1880s. I read every one of them. The earliest stone was a man named Coleman Tate, born 1822, died 1881. He was the great-great-grandfather Brennan had mentioned, the one who'd bought the land. There were maybe 40 stones in total, ranging from his to a stone for the Brennan's father, who died in 2009. There was one stone that was older than Coleman's. It was set off to the side, against the back fence, and it was a flat slab without lettering. It was older than the rest of the cemetery. Older, I thought, than the cemetery itself. The slab had a shape pecked into it that I won't describe, because I don't want to draw it again, even with words. It was small, not threatening on its face. The kind of mark you might miss if you were walking through the graveyard quickly. I stood in front of it for about 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, the wind in the laurel above the cemetery stopped completely, and I realized I couldn't hear any birds. I left the cemetery and I walked back to the cabin. I noted the slab in my book. I did not photograph it. I have a rule about photographing certain things, which is that I don't. That afternoon, I drove down to the house and asked Brennan about the cemetery. He said yes, it was the family cemetery. I asked him about the slab against the back fence. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, it had been there before the family bought the land. He said his great-great-grandfather had left it in place as a courtesy. I asked him to whom. He said, to the people who were here first. I asked him who that was. He said he didn't know. He said the family had never known. He said it was just understood that the slab stayed where it was, and the cemetery was built around it, and that was the arrangement. I want to stop here and say that I knew, at this point, exactly what I was looking at. I had seen this pattern before, not this specific situation, but the structure of it. A family arrives on land that already has a tenant. The family makes a small accommodation, often without fully understanding it. The accommodation continues across generations, refined by each generation, mostly by feel. The family prospers. The land prospers. There is an occasional cost, paid quietly, absorbed into the family's history as misfortune. A child in the 1890s, a herd in the 1930s, a handful of cattle now. This is a system that works for the family. It is not a system that works for an outsider who steps into it. I knew I should leave. I want that on the record. I knew. I had broken the second rule by coming, and now I was watching myself decide whether to break the third rule by staying. I stayed. I'll tell you why, and the reason is small and human and not mystical. Brennan had a son, the boy I'd heard upstairs, who I had not yet seen. Coletta brought me a sandwich on the porch that afternoon while I was talking to Brennan, and she set it down and said, quietly, almost to herself, that the boy had stopped eating dinner with them in February. Brennan didn't react. She went back inside. I asked Brennan, after she was gone, about the boy. He said the boy was 16 and was going through a phase. I asked him what kind of phase. He said the boy had started sleeping during the day and staying up at night, and had stopped going to school the second week of February, and was mostly in his room. I asked Brennan if I could meet the boy. He said the boy didn't really meet new people anymore. That was the moment I should have left. I want to be clear about this. The pattern I was looking at had a name in my head, even if I didn't say it out loud. The cattle were a maintenance cost. The boy was the actual payment. The family had not managed the arrangement well in this generation, or the arrangement had escalated, or the boy had drifted into the part of the arrangement that the family had been keeping the children out of for 140 years. I didn't know which. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that Brennan had hired me, and Brennan had not told me about the boy until I asked, and Brennan was not asking me to save the boy. I didn't know yet what Brennan was asking me to do. I had a guess. The guess was bad enough that I wanted to be wrong about it. I went back to the cabin. I sat with my notebook for a long time. I wrote down everything I knew, and then I wrote down everything I didn't know, and the second list was longer than the first. I made a decision. I would stay one more night, and on that night I would not work the lower pasture. I would work the house. Specifically, I would set up a long-range observation of the boy's bedroom window from the tree line above the house with the thermal scope. I wanted to see what came and went from that window, if anything did. I want to say that this was a professional decision. It wasn't entirely. It was also that I have a daughter, and she was 19 at the time, and the boy was 16, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a line had been crossed that I didn't articulate until later. I waited until full dark. I walked down from the cabin along the tree line on the east side of the hollow, slow, no light, my boots wrapped in cloth to soften my step. I found a spot about 200 yards above the house with a clear sight line to the back of the building, where I could see the boy's bedroom window. The window was on the second floor, on the corner of the addition. There was a faint light behind the curtain, a candle or a small lamp. I set up the thermal scope on a small tripod, and I lay down on a folded tarp, and I watched. For the first hour, nothing. The boy's heat signature moved around the room twice. He sat down. He stood up. He lay on the bed. I could see Brennan and Coletta downstairs, in the parlor, sitting in chairs that didn't move. The dogs were in the barn. The cattle were out of sight. In the second hour, the boy's heat signature went still on the bed. I assumed he was asleep. In the third hour, the boy's heat signature got up off the bed and went to the window, and a second heat signature appeared on the outside of the window. And I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I have spent a year thinking about it, and I am still not sure what I saw. The second heat signature was not on the ground. It was at the level of the window on the outside of the house, and the window was on the second floor. The signature was about the size and shape of a tall, thin man, but not exactly. The proportions were wrong in a way the thermal scope didn't fully resolve, because the scope reads heat, and the second figure was not warmer than the air around it. It was colder. It read on the scope as a man-shaped absence, an outline of cold against the slightly warmer wall of the house. The boy at the window did not open the window. I watched for that. He stood at the window, and the cold figure stood at the window, and they were still, and neither of them moved, for what I clocked at 11 minutes. Then the cold figure was gone. It didn't move down. It didn't move sideways. The signature simply was not there anymore. The boy stood at the window for another minute, and then he went back to the bed and lay down, and his heat signature went still again. I stayed where I was for another hour. I did not move. I did not breathe loud. I tracked everything. Nothing else happened. Around 3 a.m, I packed the scope and walked back up to the cabin, and I did not light the lantern when I got there. And I lay in the bunk with my sidearm on my chest, and I did not sleep. In the morning, I packed my equipment. I want to be clear about what I had and hadn't decided. I had decided to leave. I had not yet decided whether I would say anything to Brennan or just go. I had not decided what, if anything, I owed the boy. I had not decided whether I would call the sheriff in Perry County who'd referred me and tell him not to refer anyone else here. I drove down to the house at 7 a.m. Brennan was on the porch. He was waiting for me. He had been waiting for me, I think, since I'd walked down to the tree line the night before. He'd known I was up there. I don't know how he'd known, but he'd known. He stood up when I parked. He didn't smile. He said, "You saw him." I said I'd seen something. He nodded. He sat back down in the chair from the photograph in the hallway, and he said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything. I knew you wouldn't come if I told you everything." I asked him what he thought he had hired me for. He said, "My grandfather did this part, and his father before him, and his father before him." He said, "You do it once, and then it's done for your generation." He said, "I can't do it. I have tried for 2 months. I cannot do it." He said, "I needed somebody who has done work like this, who would understand, who could come in and do it once and leave and not be from here." I asked him what the part was. He told me. I'm not going to repeat what he said. I will tell you the shape of it. The arrangement his great-great-grandfather had made in 1881 was that the family could have the land, and the family could prosper on the land, and in exchange, in each generation, a Tate would meet the tenant formally at the slab in the cemetery on a specific night, and the meeting would be witnessed, and the meeting would renew the arrangement. The witnessing was the part the head of the household did. Brennan's father had done it in 1971. Brennan's grandfather had done it in 1934. The dates lined up with the bad years, the years the family lost more than usual. The years the meeting happened were the years the cost was paid. The boy was 16. The boy was the next Tate. The boy had been visited. The visitations had begun in October. The same month the cattle losses began. The boy was being prepared. The meeting was supposed to happen in April, on a date Brennan named. Brennan had hired me to be the witness. He could not be the witness because he had been the witness in 1989 when his father had passed it to him. And a man can only be the witness once. The boy could not be the witness because the boy was the one being introduced. There had to be a third person at the slab. The third person, in the family's history, had always been an outsider, a drifter, a hired man, somebody passing through. They had been paid, and they had witnessed, and they had gone. Some of them had gone home. Some of them had not. I asked Brennan what happened to the ones who had not. He said he didn't know. He said the family had stopped asking, somewhere around the 1920s, what happened to them. He said the arrangement covered the family. It did not cover the witness. I want to tell you that I said something dignified at this point. I want to tell you that I told him no, that I told him I knew his trick, that I told him to find somebody else, and then I drove off into the dawn. I didn't. I sat on his porch and I looked at him, and I didn't say anything for a long time because I was running through every job I'd ever taken in 14 years and counting the ones where the client had been honest with me from the start, and I was realizing that the count was lower than I'd thought it was. I finally asked him, "What happens if the meeting doesn't happen?" He said, "The arrangement ends." He said, "The land takes back what it gave." He said it without emotion, the way a man reads a clause in a contract. I asked him, "What does that mean for you, for your wife, for the boy?" He didn't answer that question. He looked at his hands. I stood up. I told him I needed to think. I told him I'd give him an answer by the end of the day. I walked off the porch and I drove up to the cabin and I packed my truck and I drove off the property without seeing him again. I drove all the way to Whitesburg and I checked back into the same motel I'd left 2 days before, and I sat on the bed and I thought. I want to walk through what I thought because this is the part of the story that matters most to me, and I have replayed it many times in the year since, and I have not been able to find a different answer. I could leave. I could drive back to Pennsylvania and never speak of this again. The arrangement would end. Whatever the land took back, it would take back from the Tates. Brennan and Coletta and the boy would face whatever was coming. I had not made the arrangement. I had not benefited from the arrangement. I owed them nothing. I could go back and witness. I would be paid, and the family would be safe for another generation, and I would walk away from the slab and drive home and add a fourth rule to my list, which was never go back to Kentucky. I could go back and do something else. I could go back and break the arrangement. I could try to remove the tenant. This was the option that 14 years of work pulled me toward, because removing things was what I did, and the idea of leaving a tenant in place after I'd seen its outline on a thermal scope at 3 in the morning felt like a failure of the trade. I sat with these 3 options for about 6 hours. I want to tell you which one I chose. I chose the second one. I want to be honest about that. I chose to witness. I chose it because the boy was 16 years old, and because Brennan was a man who had been afraid for 2 months and had not slept, and because Coletta had brought me a sandwich and had said quietly that her son had stopped eating dinner with them. I chose it because I am, at the bottom of myself, a man who took money to solve other people's problems, and the problem in front of me had a price. I drove back to the property in the late afternoon. I told Brennan I would do it. He didn't react. I think he had known I would, the same way he had known I'd been on the ridge the night before. He told me the date. It was 11 days away. He told me what would be required of me, which was almost nothing. I would walk to the slab at a specific time on the specific night, and I would stand at a specific place, and the boy would walk up from the house, and the meeting would happen, and I would not speak, and I would not move, and when it was over, I would walk back to the cabin and pack and leave, and I would be paid. I want to tell you what happened on the 11th night. I will tell you what I can. I walked to the cemetery at the time he had named. The night was clear. There was a half moon. I didn't bring a light. I didn't bring a weapon because I had decided somewhere in the 11 days, that bringing a weapon to a meeting like this would be the kind of mistake that ends a man. And I had also decided that any weapon I brought would not work anyway. I stood where Brennan had told me to stand, which was just inside the iron gate, at the corner of the fence, about 6 feet from the slab. The boy walked up the path from the house at the time Brennan had told me he would. He was thin. I had still not seen his face clearly because I had not seen him in daylight, and I did not see his face clearly that night either because he kept his head down. He was wearing pants and a shirt and no shoes. He walked past me without looking at me, and he stopped in front of the slab. There was nothing else there. I want to say that. The slab was a slab. The cemetery was a cemetery. The wind was moving in the laurel above us. I could hear the creak down the hill. The boy stood in front of the slab for a long time. I did not move. I did not speak. After what I think was about 20 minutes, the boy spoke. He spoke in a voice that was his, but also not his. And what he said was not in English. And I am not going to attempt to describe the sound of it because I have tried, and I cannot. And the attempt makes it worse. He spoke for maybe 4 minutes. He stopped. There was a silence, and then the silence was answered. I want to be careful here because this is the part I have not been able to fit into any frame I have. The answer did not come from the slab. The answer did not come from the air. The answer came from inside me. Something in my chest answered the boy, not in words, in a kind of pressure. A yes that was not mine, and that I had not given permission for. I had come to be a witness. A witness is a third party, separate from the two parties to the arrangement. The arrangement, for it to be valid, required a third party who was outside of it. I felt myself being made not outside of it. I'm going to tell you what I did. I don't know if it was the right thing. I think about whether it was the right thing every day. I broke the witnessing. I spoke. I said one word. The word was no. I said it in English, in my own voice, at a normal volume, the way you'd say it to a dog that was about to step into the road. The boy turned. He looked at me, and I saw his face, and his face was a 16-year-old boy's face, and his eyes were his own. The pressure in my chest stopped. The yes that was not mine left me. The boy stood there for a long moment. He looked at me like a person waking up from a dream and trying to remember where he was. Then he sat down. He sat down on the ground in front of the slab, and he put his face in his hands, and he started crying. He cried like a child, not like a teenager. He cried the way my daughter cried when she was 8 years old, and I told her my brother had died. I stood where I was. I did not move. I was waiting for something to happen. I was waiting for whatever the tenant was to come and take me, since the meeting had been broken, and I was the one who had broken it. I was prepared for that. I was, at that point, prepared for almost anything. Nothing came. I waited for what I think was about an hour. The boy stopped crying. He stood up. He walked past me, out of the cemetery, down the path toward the house. He didn't look at me. I followed him at a distance. He went into the house. The light in his bedroom window came on. I went up to the cabin. I packed my truck in the dark. I drove off the property without speaking to Brennan, without leaving a note, without taking the second half of the payment that was sitting in an envelope on the table in the cabin. I left the envelope. I drove to Whitesburg. I drove from Whitesburg to Lexington. I drove from Lexington to Cincinnati. I drove from Cincinnati to Erie. I did not stop except for gas. I got home a little after noon the next day. I want to tell you what I felt when I crossed the state line out of Kentucky. I felt like a man who had stepped off a sinking boat onto a dock, and the dock was solid, and I was on it, and I was alive. I felt that for about 4 hours. Then I started to feel the other thing. The other thing is what I want to end on, and it is the reason I quit, and it is why I have not been able to go back to the work. A week after I got home, I was at the grocery store in Erie, in the produce section, and a woman a few feet from me dropped a bag of apples. The bag split. The apples rolled. She made a small, embarrassed sound. I bent down to help her pick them up. As I picked up an apple, I felt, in my chest, the same pressure I had felt at the slab. The yes that wasn't mine. It came up in me for half a second, in response to something the woman had not said and had not done, just in response to her being there. I dropped the apple. I stood up. I left the store. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for an hour. It has happened 7 more times since. Once at a gas station in Mercer County when the attendant handed me my change. Once at my daughter's apartment in Ohio when she opened the door. Once at a stoplight in Erie with no one else in the car when a man crossed the street in front of me. Once at my own kitchen sink, alone with the water running, looking out the window at the yard. It is always small. It is always brief. It does not control me. I can feel it rise and I can feel it pass and I do not act on it, but it is in me. Something at that slab put something in me. And when I broke the witnessing, I did not break it cleanly, and a piece of the arrangement attached to me on the way out, the way a burr attaches to your pant leg when you walk through a field. I carry it now. It does not ask me for anything. It has not asked me for anything in the year since. I do not know if it will. I do not know what it would be asking for, if it did. I quit the work because I could not go back into a client's house with this in me. I could not sit at a kitchen table and do an intake and ask a widow what she dreamed about with this thing in my chest waiting to answer for me. The trade requires that you be a third party. You are outside the situation, and you assess it from outside, and you act on it from outside. I am no longer reliably outside of anything. I have not told Brennan Tate. I have not contacted him. I do not know what happened to the boy. I do not know if the arrangement held or ended or went into some other shape I cannot picture. I do not want to know. I have looked up the property once on a county record site to see if the deed had changed hands. It hadn't. That was 9 months ago. I haven't looked again. I told my daughter I'd retired. She asked me why, and I told her I'd had a bad job and I'd realized it was time. She accepted that. She is a kind person and she trusts me, and she did not ask more. I do not believe I am dangerous. I have watched myself for a year. The pressure does not push me. It rises, it sits, it passes. I am the same person I have been for 48 years, with one quiet, additional resident. But I am not the man who took the call from Brennan Tate. That man believed his 3 rules were enough. That man believed the work was patient and the trappers went home. That man had a binder for every job and a system that worked, and he believed the system was the reason he was alive. I am alive because a 16-year-old boy turned around when I said no. I am alive because something in that cemetery decided, for reasons I will never know, not to take the offered substitute. I am alive on terms that were not set by me, and that I do not understand, and that I do not have access to. That is why I quit. Not because I was afraid. I have been afraid for 14 years, and fear was a tool. I quit because the trade requires a man who knows what he is, and I no longer know what I am, and I am not willing to walk into another person's home and sit at their table and pretend that I do. If you ever get a call from a man in Letcher County named Brennan Tate, or anyone with that last name on that land, I want you to do something for me. I want you to listen politely. I want you to take down the address, and then I want you to tell him you cannot help him, and I want you to hang up the phone, and I want you to lose the address. The arrangement is not yours. Do not become a third party to it. That's what I have to say. That's the whole of it. I'm going to put this away now, and I'm not going to speak about it again.